Looks so cozy over there. So I want to start out by talking a little about, and we mentioned this a little bit, the history of spirituality and religion, and the cycle that it goes through. So things start out with certain traditions and beliefs, and then there's someone comes along with revelation, someone like Jesus who overturned the tradition of Moses and the Old Testament with a new revelation. And the same in India, where the priests were very much in control, you might say. In India, Buddha came along, and Buddha never left India. His whole life he lived there, and Buddhism didn't spread out of India until after he passed on. But he was also someone who saw the you might even say the corruption or in the priesthood and in the traditions as they were being presented, and through his own enlightenment showed a new not necessarily a new approach, but a new understanding and new practices in India. So the spiritual teachers are typically not people who just follow the traditions or the norms, but who have something new to bring, and usually they're teachers who disrupt the belief systems that are familiar to us. And we might have an expectation about spiritual teachers. I remember when I met Swami Satchidananda, who was a well-known teacher of yoga and tradition from India. He kind of looked like Santa Claus. He just maybe I can get a picture out and show you. He just was this ideal of this spiritual teacher. And I spent about 10 days at a retreat where he was a treat learning to be a yoga teacher. But many teachers who are here to kind of break down our traditional way of thinking, our traditional patterns. And I remember one of the first teacher I met when I was looking for a spiritual guide, which was in 1970. I was 30. Hello. His chair back there. You can sit on the floor if you like, whatever you prefer. Welcome. As the first spiritual teacher I had met, I was looking to find a teacher, so I went to spend time with Swami Satchidananda, and before that, Chogyam Trungpa, who was a very well-known Tibetan teacher who, I think the Shambhala Center here in Madison is a center that, in his tradition, and he started Naropa Institute in in Colorado, which has master's programs, and so he's very well known, but he's also known as being kind of a rascal. So when I first went to this was when he first came to this country. He had some students in Nova Scotia who came down with him to do this workshop in Pennsylvania, in rural Pennsylvania. And after the first day of the workshop, the students had been studying with him in Nova Scotia, invited me. He said, "Oh, Trungpa's going to come and teach us in the evening, a special group, and you can join us." So we drove in 3 or 4 different cars, and we went to this. I know you like stories. So I'm trying to story. We went to this sort of bar, tavern in the country, and there must have been about 16 of us, 12 to 16. And so we went into this back room so we could all sit together. And there was a big square table that we could all fit in. And so Trungpa was sitting there and sort of teaching, and he was drinking sake, and the waitress would come and bring him sake every once in a while. And he had a water pistol. And he liked squirting the students as we were sitting around. And they didn't mind. But then he started squirting the waitress. She didn't like that. So that went on for a while. We were sitting there maybe an hour and a half, and he was even though he was drinking sake, he was teaching these advanced students, and then we got up to go, and in the front of the tavern there was a pool table. So these guys were playing pool, and Trungpa goes up to, stands right in behind the guy as he's about to shoot his shot. So when he pulls his arm back, he bumps into him. So they didn't like that either. He purposely did that. And so these guys followed us out of the tavern, 5 or 6 of them, and they had their pickup trucks, and they were hunters, I suppose, because they had these guns, and they pulled their guns down. They didn't point them at any of us, but they're standing with their guns, telling, "We don't want you around here. Don't come back anymore." So there's like hundreds of stories about him, kind of in that kind of characterization, where he would just do things that were sort of off the wall, unexpected. He would come late to his talks, 2-3 hours. Sometimes he would come drunk. And, we would think, how can this guy be a genuine teacher if he's drinking and so he would upset all of our expectations. I often wonder, what if I had followed him instead of the teacher that I followed? They had a center that was right next to a yoga center where the yogi people were very disciplined, and they were kind of wild, so they'd leave the blinds up and they'd be nude and doing all kinds of things just on purpose to the people in the yoga center. So that was my first introduction to a spiritual teacher. When I met Swami Satchidananda, he seemed pretty normal in contrast to that, but it was an unexpected introduction. So many of these teachers are maybe not as extreme as Chogyam Trungpa, but they're, in their own way, they want to bring us out of the sort of habit of thinking in a certain way and being in a certain way and waking up to the reality that's behind our ordinary everyday experience. And without these teachers, what happens with a spiritual awakening, with a spiritual tradition, it becomes a religion, and the priest, if you study the history of Christianity, then the priests start taking over, and before there was a written printing press in the earlier days, the priest would be the authority about what's the nature of heaven, or what kind of, how should one be to go to heaven when we pass away, and what beliefs you should have. And even today in the Christian Catholic Church, there maybe others, there's this, I believe in this and this and this and this, and it's all based on beliefs rather than one's direct experience, awakened experience. And with the printing press, that hold of the priest in some ways diminished, because people could read the Bible for themselves. But even then, it's still based on the particular interpretation and particular belief system. And so in the whether it's Christianity or Buddhism, this occurs in all different traditions. It's not to pick on one over another, that the direct experience is lost, and we'll talk later about how that gets lost in favor of a certain regimen, a certain way you're supposed to be, and religion becomes a sort of a cultural process rather than a spiritual. There may be a spiritual sense in the sense of being kind to others and being generous and so on, but the direct realization of our oneness with all is just about totally lost in the organized religions. And interestingly, to me, we're coming into a new era where we're interested more in direct experience. And I believe that psychedelics have played a big role in the last 20 years, or last 50 years, in leading us to have a direct experience of oneness, at least for a limited time. We don't stay in that experience of oneness, but it changes our beliefs, it changes the way we look at the world, and so there's a carryover that happens. And so psychedelics are one way that that's occurring. And I've been talking about spirituality as embodied awareness, as being a new kind of emergence in our experience of spirituality. And I want to talk more about that today. We mentioned before in the Indian tradition, the earliest teachings and most profound teachings come from some scriptures called the Vedas that come from about 1500 BC to about 1200 BC, it's thought. And this was also before things were written down. So the way these teachings were passed on is that certain families, their whole job would be to memorize these scriptures word for word. It wasn't like we think about maybe the Bible was written 100 years after Jesus or whatever, and maybe there were changes, and as it was retranslated and passed on, and we don't know how much of the original we have. In India, they memorized word for word these sacred scriptures called the Vedas, which taught about one's oneness with all being. And at the end of the Vedas, the end period, there are some scriptures called the Upanishads. And the Upanishads talked about the self, that's not the personal self, but the self that's universal, that is never born, that never dies, that is a universal divine consciousness, and that self is the essence of who we are. Literally, the Upanishad means a student sitting at the feet of a teacher, and learning directly from the teacher. And so and that period of the Upanishads that teaching is called Vedanta, if you've heard that word. And Vedanta literally means the end of the Vedas. Veda and Anti means after, or in English there's that word has come down to us. And so these teachings of the Upanishads are, as I've been talking about in previous meetings, emphasize the oneness that we are, and that in reaching that oneness of consciousness, it's in that tradition, it's about leaving the world behind. The world is considered to be Maya or illusion and not worth bothering about. The goal would be to experience our direct oneness with all being. And of course, in India, believing in reincarnation, the notion was then one doesn't have to come back into a physical body again, having had that realization. And so that's been the tradition in this whole work of self-inquiry and this understanding, at least in the Indian tradition, of the one universal consciousness that we are. And it hasn't been in favor of or very much supporting the idea of being fully awake and alive and embodied and being in the world. It's more a tradition of leaving the world behind. So all that is leading up to, I wanted to talk about another tradition in India, which is called Tantra. Now, in Tantra, that term these days in popular culture, people are New Age culture. People tend to think of it as Tantra is about kind of taking sexual experiences to a spiritual level. And we do tantric practices. We do breathing when we're with a partner physically. We focus on certain centers and all. It takes it out of the pure lustful experience into a spiritual connection between male and female. And so that's sort of the popular notion of Tantra. But Tantra is really much more than that, and it's a tradition as old as the Upanishads and the Vedas, a very ancient tradition that from the very beginning is about living spiritually in the world and making use of any experience in the world as an avenue to awakening to our true nature. So it's about experiencing spirit in all of life. And it also focuses on the union of the male and female divine principles. And the male principle is represented as Shiva. And Shiva, kind of, I'll show you a painting. It's a traditional painting of Shiva. Can you see that? It's kind of, you see that? Okay. So Shiva sits on top of Mount Kailash, I think, or a mountain in India, and he's in this blissful state, and not only does he not care about the world, but his purpose, the purpose of Shiva, who's considered a deity, a god, is to rid people of their illusions. So Shiva is also called the destroyer, strangely enough. He destroys all our illusions, all our attachments, but he doesn't do it actively in the world. He's sitting in contemplation and meditation in this ultimate state. Now, the female aspect of the divine nature is called Shakti. Shakti is the aspect of divinity that is involved in the world, is manifests in the world, and it's just the opposite in a way of Shiva. And interesting enough, when you lie down in yoga and you do Shavasana it comes from Shiva, but when Shiva it's also called the corpse pose, right? So Shiva without Shakti becomes Shava, or the corpse pose. And in the Jewish tradition, when someone dies, it's called sitting Shiva. I don't know how that connection comes about, but for 10 days, one sits with the corpse. So in a way, yes, Tantra is about the union of the male and female principles, but not. And there are different schools of Tantra, and it's not necessarily meant to be about two people having a sexual act. There's much more to it, and much more subtle aspects to it. So the word Tantra, the word mantra, we're all familiar with. That's a very popular word. It's used in all kinds of ways that are not traditional. So mantra is comes from the tantric tradition, And so the tantric tradition is all about living embodied in the world and practices in the world that lead you to awakening while still involved in the world. And so mantras are used. There's another term called yantra. This is a yantra. It's the pictorial equivalent, can you see that? Pictorial equivalent of a mantra. And so a yogi would meditate on a figure like this. This represents the female form. And so there's a whole variety of these. And if one takes a psychedelic, one becomes aware that there's a life in this. It's not just looking at a picture, but there's a life in this. And then you may be familiar with the word chakras. Is that familiar? Chakras are centers of consciousness that correspond to different areas in the body. And they're centers of consciousness when you're in one, or let's call them modes of consciousness. When you're in one mode of consciousness, you have an entirely different experience than you do in another mode of consciousness. And traditionally, in the Indian tradition, in the tantric tradition, there are 7 chakras. And there may be other traditions that say there are more than 7. But 7 is the most common understanding of how many chakras and what they are. So understanding these different modes of consciousness help us to understand different ways of living in the world and how to transcend those, the limitations are the places we may get stuck in those ways of living. So one way I like to think of it, and I'll try to go through these 7, would you be interested in that? One way I like to think of it as a kind of a metaphor or a way of kind of visualizing or feeling this is, if you think of you have an elevator in front of you, and you step into the elevator and it takes you to the first level. The first level, you step out of the elevator and your whole preoccupation becomes about survival. It becomes a fear of dying, a fear of being injured, about fear of being traumatized, or experiences of dying and feeling traumatized and injured. It's like being in a war, just being in a war zone, for example, or being in a situation a volcano's gone off and you can't escape from it, or you're in the middle of a fire and you can't escape. Or it could be abuse of various kinds, but it's that kind of experience, a feeling of impending death, or actually dying, or fear of death. And it may come from a situation like I've just described, or it may come from actually the process of dying, or even the process of being born. Different followers of Freud, different people in his sphere, looked at the world and what causes neuroses or psychosis, what causes emotional problems. From different ones thought that something different was the main cause of our problems. And one of the people in Freud's circles was named Otto Rank. And he said that what causes all of our issues, emotional issues, is what he called the birth trauma. And he explained how he thought the birth trauma was the source of all of our suffering in life. Now, interestingly enough, the most well-known psychedelic therapist is named Stan Grof, who has been has done psychedelic therapy with thousands of people since the probably 1950s, I believe. And he also talks about the birth trauma. He talks, but in more detail, he talks about the different stages of the birth process and how the new baby is a fetus is comes into the birth is maybe in a more blissful state, and then as it comes into the birth canal, it's very narrow and stuck, and actually goes through a trauma. And he talks about 4 stages until the 4th stage where the baby comes out of the womb and is freed from that confinement. And Grof felt that that process is kind of relived in life when a person feels confined and fearful and all. It's a living of that birth trauma. So that was his view of. I think there's a larger way to understand that, and life is about, for all of us, dying occurs, whether it's physical dying, whether it's dying in the sense of our partner has passed on and our relationship has died and we've just separated, and our whatever we've held on to, whatever we've clung to, we have a struggle and a trauma. If we're really dependent on a person or on something, we really have a struggle of letting go of that and being free and being reborn out of that particular way that we've focused ourselves. So this is what happens. So these chakras, some people tend to live more from one chakra or 2 chakras and not able to access the others. And also another way of seeing it is that every individual, or most individuals, are experiencing from one of these chakras or another at different times. And so we may have had experiences of trauma in the past, and those traumas from the past tend to stay in our body. And we've talked last time about how the body holds all kinds of traumas and fears and how ways that might be released through body work, through myofascial release work of different kinds, like Rolfing and so on. So there's as I said last time, there's a lot of focus these days psychologically on the body and on trauma. Just 20 years ago, there wasn't that much interest or focus, but it's now become lots of books and lots of interest and lots of therapy is centered around releasing trauma. And so that's all around this first chakra, or most of it is. And then of course there's the psychedelic research that's focused on, for example, on veterans or those who have been in wars or who have been traumatized and who have PTSD, and using, for example, MDMA is especially helpful because, I'm saying because, there may be other reasons, but because MDMA leads one into a place of loving acceptance, and one is able to feel into the PTSD and the fear and the trauma in a way that's not kind of going back in and reliving it and making it worse, but in a way that this loving, allowing to be, lets that part of us that's so afraid feel acceptance and accepted and loved, and then that is able to release. That's one of the valuable, most valuable way that's coming forward in working with trauma. So these are some of the things about the first chakra. If we come back into the elevator now and we go up to the next level, it's a whole different world. And this experience is all about pleasure, or lack of pleasure. And these chakras are related to parts of the body. The first is near the anus, the second near the genitals, and the element of the first is earth, of the second is water. And so it's about emotionality and seeking pleasure. And most of us are looking for situations that give us pleasure. Whatever floats our boat, so to speak, that term. Whatever kind of gives us pleasure, whether it's going out and dancing, or sexuality, or accumulating lots of money, or we're seeking what we have attached the situation to it being the most pleasurable for us. But all of those pleasurable experience carry a drama with it. They carry, we have the pleasure and then we lose it. It's temporary and sometimes and often incomplete. And so the spiritual teachings, the teachings of the Upanishads or of Tantra, say that pleasure is already within us. We think that having this experience, having this new car, that's pleasurable, as though it's the experience that's giving us the pleasure. But the pleasure starts inside. The joy, the ananda, the term ananda or bliss, starts inside, and it doesn't need any object to be experienced. In fact, if we kind of withdraw from objects and so that we experience the bliss unrelated to objects, it's more intense, it's more fulfilling, it's more enrapturing, it's actually more wonderful. Now, that doesn't mean, then there's some people who say, I'm going to be an ascetic, I'm going to not have pleasure, I'm going to, because I don't want to dissipate myself in lust and one of the deadly sins or whatever, so I'm going to hold myself tight and keep myself strong and not give in to that. But that becomes a distortion and a perversion in itself, and it can lead to just the opposite, kind of seeking out of kind of uncontrolled searching for pleasure, even that goes against, because I'm trying to be one way and I'm not letting myself be all of myself. So these are some of the issues that come up. And so there's some therapeutic traditions that, so for example, bioenergetic analysis is one that works with the client in therapy to recover their innate pleasure. The less we feel the innate joy and abundance and ecstasy within, the more we tend to look at it outside. We tend to either look for it outside or just don't feel it. And so in bioenergetic analysis, the client is encouraged to recover their body, to feel their body, to feel all the feelings in their body, to open up to the places that have been contracted through a therapeutic. Sometimes in bioenergetics, it might be expressing anger and helping the client to actually kick and scream and let out anger, for example. So that's one avenue that Western therapy is attempting to help the patients experience the natural pleasure within. With most of us, we're very constricted in how much pleasure we really allow ourselves to feel for various reasons. Again, it may be related to trauma or ways that we're supposed to think we're supposed to believe, and so on. So this is what the second chakra is about, is recovering that natural innate ananda within. And again, in every chakra, my sense is that it's the unconditionally loving awareness that is the real healing. That when we feel into and accept the parts of us that are constricted and allow it to be, and when we allow ourselves, who hasn't allowed myself to express anger, to feel that and to open up these tight places in myself, it's through self-acceptance, through unconditionally accepting oneself in these various ways that healing occurs. So let's come to the third chakra. Let's go in the elevator and move up a notch. And so in the third chakra, it's a whole different experience. It's not about trauma, it's not about pleasure, it's about winning and losing. It's about competition. It's about whether in sports competition, in thinking I'm better than you, or I know more than you. It can take all kinds of forms. I know more than you. I'm more successful than you. I'm more relaxed than you. And so a lot of our society is focused on this chakra. You know, it's and also the Alfred Adler was the therapist in Freud's community that focused on that, and he talked about the inferiority complex. And he was saying that it's this chakra, this issue of competition, not feeling good enough, needing to prove myself, needing to be better than. This chakra is always about win-lose. There's no win-win in this chakra. And by the way, in the second chakra, Wilhelm Reich was the person in Freud's circle who focused on sensuality and sexuality and pleasure as being the important thing that causes, when we're contracted in that area, that causes psychological misfunctioning. So there's no win if you're looking at the world from the second chakra. It's always about competing, all sports. So I had an experience once with LSD where I experienced myself as, it just suddenly came upon me. I just was winning. Like I was in this place of, I just threw the Super Bowl touchdown that won the Super Bowl, or I just hit the home run that won the World Series, or I just pitched the perfect game. And I could turn my attention to any area, and while I was in that consciousness, I was like, I wanted everything. And I don't know how that came about. It was just a spontaneous experience once taking LSD. But it also changed, to some degree. It made me feel I've already won everything. Maybe I don't have to be so competitive. When we come to awareness, not that I did fully in that LSD experience, but when we come to awareness of our the self that we are, nothing is lost or won, because first of all, we are everything and everyone, and the self is eternal. It can't be lost. It can't be. So it transcends any idea of a need to compete. There's no inferiority. There's no sense or feeling of I need to prove myself in any way. So let's come to the fourth chakra. So the first three chakras are more troublesome in our lives. They create more stress and problems, although the others can too. The fourth chakra is at the heart center. The third chakra is at the belly center. It's the area of power, just to finish up on that. And people take it as power over somebody. But as we mature and as we evolve, we open to realizing it's about empowerment, not empower over anybody. It's feeling empowered to do well and to function without the idea of win, lose, or better or worse, just feeling empowered in the world. So we come into the elevator, we leave that, and we come into this heart center. And so the physiology is also related to what's going on psychologically. In the heart center, this is the area of humanism, where our heart opens. We're not talking about the emotional heart feeling so as much as the might say the spiritual heart, the sense of feeling generous beyond the sense of lack in the third chakra, feeling a fullness of the heart that just wants to share and give and naturally express that sharing. Not at the necessarily at the expense of one's being, one can be overly sacrificing oneself, and that can be problematic. But in a full, generous way, an empowered way of just wanting to give in the world, wanting to express love, or not even wanting, just expressing love because we feel a sense of love from the heart. I want to mention here too, have you heard of Abraham Maslow, any of you? So Maslow, I believe he talked about needs in a person, and he talks of, and I believe he must have been influenced by the system of chakras. He talked about the basic need of safety. There's another one down there. Maybe I don't have it. I think there's another physiological needs, like food and so on. It's missing. Safety, belonging and love, esteem. So he has them backwards in terms of a self-esteem being below the chakra of love. And cognitive, aesthetic, self-actualization, and transcendence. So I just wanted to point out how parallel that is to what we're talking about. Am I going on too long here?
No.
No? Okay. So let's go to the next chakra. Is very interesting, is the throat center. And the throat center, think about what you do in this part of your anatomy. You take in food, take in nurturance, and going back, going back to the center here at the belly, what's here, the food is digested and gives us energy. So this is the third chakra, the belly center, is about energy. But this is where we take in the nurturance. And it's also where we speak from. Now those seem to be very different. And this is actually the center of devotion. Here at the heart, it's humanistic, and that can be very loving. But here we begin to turn towards something more transcendent, and we feel devoted. So we might be devoted to the original teacher of our spiritual tradition, our religion. It might be, so there can be many objects of devotion, and And so to connect the voice and the throat and the taking in, it's a cycle. If you're going back to Western music, I'm not necessarily talking about all of indigenous music and so on, but Western music originates with Gregorian chant. And Gregorian chant, all the chanters are chanting in unison. There's no one taking it. That comes later. As it develops, then different parts and so on. But here, there's no like individual, I've got my part and I'm outstanding and all. The chanters are all chanting as one. And the chanting is devotional chanting. So music originally, and at least in the Western tradition, in what we call the classical music, as it evolved, was all devotional, was all singing to God or to as God was thought of or understood in that, primarily in Christian tradition. I forgot to mention, I don't want to leave these out, so they come up as I think of them. The chakras in the Kabbalah, in the Jewish tradition, there's a very elaborate exploration of these centers of consciousness. Here's just a couple pictures showing these centers, and there are other centers in addition to that. So this book on the Kabbalah has all kinds of explanations of centers of consciousness, which in many ways parallel what we're talking about here. So this is something that's universal, but may have different ways of explaining it. So I was talking about the cycle. So through the voice, one has a connection to that which nurtures one. It's like the chanting brings us into connection with the divine, and we feel nurtured from the divine. If we're living in this chakra is living with that sense of devotion. And I talked about Ramakrishna at a certain stage of his life until he went further. His experience was one of devotion to the Divine Mother. Now this devotion can be radically distorted. We can become devoted to anything. You can become devoted to your favorite band, to the singers, and go crazy for them and follow them around. You can be devoted to a charlatan who a cult leader that you think you imagine is something very, very special because they say they're very special, and it's easy to be devoted to all kinds of cult leaders. So it's that same devotional energy, and it's a question then, where do you focus it? What becomes the object of your devotion, and is it an object worthy of your devotion, or are you going to be let down and used and disappointed because you've given up your individuality to something you feel is greater? So that can be a big problem. Even I would even go as far as to say that even a lot of our religions are cults, but because they're so shared and all, we don't see them that way. We just take it for granted that this is a worthy place to be devoted. So this is an awakening to a higher consciousness, but it's a dualistic relationship. As wonderful and blissful as it may be, if one is devoted to a transcendent awareness and not to just a cult leader, it may be very blissful. And I talked about Ramakrishna, how that was the case for him. But it's still not the highest awakening, because I'm somehow less than. I'm not completely merged with that oneness if I'm in the throat chakra. the next center is what's called the third eye, and I think, I don't know if it's mistranslated, but there's a line in the Bible, if thy eye be single, thy body or something will be full of grace. You know that, Bob, that one? It's from Matthew.
That's from here.
So I don't know if that refers to the third eye or if the translation is correct or not. But that the third eye that we hear about a lot is a center of consciousness that's a center of discrimination, of discriminating, and we talked about that last time. I showed you the sword of the Buddha, and you told me you like Durga, who has a sword. The sword of discriminating the real from the unreal. There's a prayer in Sanskrit, asatoma sadagamaya tamasoma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amrutam gamaya, which means lead us from the unreal to the real, lead us from darkness to light, lead us from mortality to immortality. And so that's talking about this discrimination, leading us from the unreality of the sort of cultural or societal norms and expectations, and watching the news and seeing all the conflict, and to what's stable, what is not impermanent, what doesn't change, what's the reality behind all this turbulence in our lives. From darkness to light, and lead us from mortality, from thinking that we're just living in this body in this lifetime and we're going to die, and maybe we're afraid of what's going to happen, or we're looking forward to get to heaven, but realizing more immortality, that we all are not any special than anybody else, but we all are divine consciousness at our core, that we all are the same one consciousness. So this chakra one is as developed that discrimination. And finally, the chakra at the crown of the head, called the 1,000-petaled lotus, is an awakening to one's oneness with all that is, not just discriminating, but opening to levels of intelligence that are more and more vast, unaccountably and infinitely vast, one more than another. So that's like sort of an overview, as I understand it, of these centers of consciousness. And this book, I don't have it here. Oh, I can't tell you. There's a book. Never mind. I'll see if I can tell you later, another time. So any questions? We're going to do some meditation. We'll take a break and do meditation. But any thoughts or questions you have about what I've been sharing? So the reason I'm focusing on this is because this tantric view gives us an understanding in many ways of the challenges in life at all these centers, and how do we live a spiritually awakened, embodied life, and deal with these issues of competition, and do we need to enter into that center? How can we move up into higher centers of awareness rather than being stuck in embodied awakening in one or two or three of the lower centers?
Well, and I've always understood that what gives us problems is when we get stuck in any of those. And usually, like I learned in holotrophic breathwork, that you move from that base, that bottom, and freed that up, and then you could move to that next level and free it. And then I'm kind of thinking if maybe the psychedelics help you kind of clear out all that crap, and you end up moving to the crown. And that's why you experience that unconditional love that people talk about.
Yeah, that makes, sure. Mhm.
Are you familiar with the Enneagram?
Yes,
Yeah, that's a good, all these are doing the same thing, just a little differently.
yeah,
I think that the gift of the Enneagram is understanding the head, heart, and the gut. Because you deal
Understanding
the
what?
head, heart, and the gut of the body,
mhm,
that all those are ideally to be balanced. And if they're not, then you get caught up in whatever you're imbalanced. And you
yeah,
know, the 3 different types in each of those centers kind of give a sense of what that person is going to be seeing or how they're going to be distorted or
yeah, it's another way of understanding individual differences in terms
Yes.
of these.
the uniqueness, I would say, of everyone.
Uniqueness, okay.
And it points to the gift, and then it points obviously to the curse of each. I mean, we're all kingdom bound in any of them, and anytime we get stuck in any of them, that's when we have the symptoms,
Yeah,
you know, the worst, if you will.
yeah. I always considered myself to be a 5, which is a kind of
Yeah.
intellectual, mental.
That's what I wonder, I thought you might be.
Yeah. Well,
I've been a
that's too bad
certified
because
teacher,
now
right?
I feel bad that you thought that because I thought I was transcending that.
Yeah, but I think, well, look, you know, that propensity is always going to be there.
Yeah,
But you know, the way you've described yourself, I mean, talks that you probably do fit that. You
Yeah.
like to observe rather than be seen, in a sense, or so you have. I mean, you
yeah.
have. You know,
And yet I feel my work in this life has been to balance that or transcend that and open my heart
Yeah.
and be present and not be an observer. And
right.
yeah.
I
Any
had-
other-
I had a question about, as you described it, something about it seemed sequential, and yet, would you say, it feels like it could be possible to working from different chakras at the same time, that it may not be the full resolution
Yeah.
of one. Is that fair
Yeah,
to say?
yeah, I agree. And,
Yeah.
and even, yeah, so I'm just, sequential doesn't mean that, you know, we move in through different chakras at different times and are at times working with issues of feeling inferior or other issues, you know. So I didn't mean it to be necessarily sequential, yeah.
Not about your description, no. In fact, and I was thinking about actually more of the collective in that comment too, thinking about how we can, as a collective, I think make great strides in moving through a collective grouping of chakras, so to speak, if I can extend that, and have openings that happen for the group and yet still have work that's been unresolved. Collect. That's where I didn't mean to say that you made it
No,
sound
I
like you
know.
have to do this, blah, blah, blah.
No,
But I
it's
see that
good.
happening a lot in
Yeah.
groups.
It's good to bring that up, yeah.
That reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you're familiar with spiral dynamics,
Yeah,
because that sort of has similarities, and I was trying to remember all the different levels of that and see if they map to the chakras at all. I know a few of them do, others are maybe a little bit more fuzzy for that, but that's the same kind of thing, where as you evolve, you can operate from different places, but you know, obviously the higher level is to, you know, the second tier is to integrate all of them and realize there's a place for all of them.
That's what I was thinking a little bit about that too, and then also this book, Reinventing Organizations, that talks about different colors of organizations. But interestingly, they stop at teal, and I thought, well, what's? I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Alan, Reinventing Organizations.
I can't hear you. With what?
It's a book about organizations, and they have them as different colors, and they kind of stop at teal, the color, and looking at the chakras,
Yeah.
it made me wonder what's next. And I think with spiral dynamics, there are more levels, or so to speak. Is that
Well, yes and no. It's kind of the first tier is like the 6 colors, which would correlate pretty much the first 6 here, I think. Because it starts out with like survival, but then it goes to like tribal dynamics. Then like a leader emerges as like the power dynamics, and then it's like law and order. And then I get a little bit fuzzy with the orange and green, because I know orange is kind of like science and logic, things in that realm, but then green is like a lot of the, like everyone is included kind of thing. There's, the next level is then basically one level, which considers the second tier, and then they do sometimes talk about another 8th level on that, but I think the idea with that is that very few people are even at that 7th level, so it's not really entirely clear yet what the next level beyond that would be.
Maybe we should take a break and just stretch, and then we'll come back and do some meditation, okay?
How you doing?
There's water in bottles over there, unless you want it real super cold. I think.
Nice to meet you. And you're Francisco.
I have a question
Francisco.
actually.
Hi, Francisco.
Is this like, when was this discovered and like how was it discovered? Or is this just like,
Can we turn that off now?
yeah, or, like
Say that again?
what like